I'm Gavin Clark with the National Museum of Computing and Reading Museum, and we're interviewing former employees and customers of Digital Equipment Corporation as part of the 60th anniversary of DEC's opening its first office in the UK. It's June the 18th, 2024, and we are in Reading. And I'm here today talking to Keith Saunders. Keith, let's please start with the basics. Please tell us your full name and your place and your year of birth.
I'm Keith Philip Saunders. I was born in Beckenham, South London, in 1951.
And what was your kind of childhood like? What was your growing up? Who were your parents and what did they do?
I had a difficult childhood. My parents met at their place of work, but subsequently, when I was born, my mother had to leave work because that's the rules in those days. And about 2 years later, my father was made redundant, and so they had to get out of the house. So we lived in a caravan for 2 years, which was pretty tough. Then we moved to various places in and around London. The most notable place was in Holborn, where I went to my first primary school. And I guess I was 4.5 at that time. And it was over the road from the trolley bus station. So I used to look out the window, and it was a pub called the Hole in the Wall. And it was actually condemned, but it was still open to the public. So we couldn't go on the top floor or anything like that. But so after that, we moved to Sidcup, South London, where I guess we spent probably 2 years. And we moved from various places because we had to. I was still very young at that time. Things didn't really become stable until we moved to Bracknell, where my father was the manager of a Whitbread off licence in Binfield Road. Higgs off licence, 125/129 Binfield Road. I can even remember the phone number. And I went to the primary school right next door to the off licence. And when we finished at the primary school, I went to Wick Hill Secondary School for about a year. Then we moved to Thatcham. My father bought Crown Mead Stores, Bath Road, Thatcham, and he'd never run a grocer's store before, but that's what happened. And I finished my schooling actually in Thatcham. My father and my mother unfortunately fell out when I was about 13, and my mother got a place in Cheveley, a cottage where we moved to. And by this time, I'd got an apprenticeship at the Atomic Energy Authority at Harwell. My father wanted me to work for the GPO, and I said, no fear. But Harwell was a good opportunity and a very good decision on my part.
So what did you, so let's step back a little bit. So what subjects were you interested in, or did you find yourself drawn to at school? Were you have a technical or engineering
Oh
kind of
yeah,
interest?
very technical. I mean, let me put it this way. At the age of 13, I would go down to the newsagents to get practical wireless and practical television. And by the age of 17, I've built my own television. Okay. So that's where we come. In fact, it's just recently I've started chucking out the old television books from 1968 that I've got. No, I was a very technical person. Even at a very young age, I would try and build things from a practical electronics book. And I'd go round to the local television shop to see if I could catch some resistors and capacitors for my project, you know. So
And what about school? Were you getting this kind of outlet at school? What was school like? What subjects did you enjoy or excel at?
the only subjects that I really enjoyed at secondary school was metalwork and woodwork and technical drawing. In other words, technical things. In metalwork, I remember for my exam, I built a steam engine at school, a working steam engine, and that was quite good. I was pleased with that. But when it came to other things, I was less interested. It's not that I couldn't do it, but I wasn't interested. Like maths, I could do it, but I wasn't interested. And I only became interested when I had to go to college because I needed qualifications in maths for electronics. So I did a year's course to get the qualifications, and that's the only time when I suddenly realised I needed maths.
So you said your dad wanted you to join the GPO.
Yeah.
Just in general, or did he have a role in mind that he wanted you to do?
No, he didn't have a role in mind. He always thought that the GPO was the pinnacle of places to go. Obviously, I had a different opinion about that. He didn't have a technical background at all. Quite the opposite. In fact, he often relied on me even to keep his car going.
Where did your interest come from then? You weren't exposed to us as a child growing up. Was it just something you found yourself doing?
Well, I don't know how my interest got in it, but I remember buying the first magazine. I guess I was probably 12 then. I was in the local newsagents, and there was practical electronics there, and it had a build this to detect the rain outside and thing, and it was very basic, but it got my. And you start reading these magazines, and you start learning, and so I'd learned quite a lot from magazines, to be honest.
Interesting.
It certainly wasn't at school, and when I did my apprenticeship at Harwell, I had day release at college where I did formal training in electronics.
So how did the apprenticeship at Harwell come up? And if you could just explain to people what is or was Harwell, what was its significance?
Well, Harwell at that time was a real atomic energy research establishment. It's not like it is today. And so, I'd go up to the reactor division and everything, and all the things you wouldn't do today. There, probably in 2 years, I probably learnt more than I'd learnt in the whole time I was at school in engineering, because you start off, even though you're doing electronics, you start off doing engineering. And I spent 6 months in Winthrith near Weymouth, where there was another reactor, and where we did all the engineering, and I learnt quite a lot in engineering terms at that point. And then we moved on to the electronics thing, and that's when the day release at college happened. And so don't forget, in those days, we didn't have integrated circuits. It was valves and transistors, so it's all discrete components. So I had a really good grounding there, and I always aimed that this was the job the apprenticeship I wanted, because there was it was a very broad range of subjects it would be covering.
How did the apprenticeship come about, and was it through school or college you got this?
No, well, school told me it existed, but I applied, and I had to go along, and you have to do some tests, and most of their tests were practical tests, and one of them, you had to bend a piece of wire into certain shapes with pliers. And ironically, I found this was dead easy, but most people found it very difficult, right? And so I passed that. So I guess there was about 20 in the room, and only 2 passed. So I was quite pleased about that. And then we had a formal interview, and they offered me an apprenticeship. In those days, there was a lot of apprentices. I think when I started, there was almost 60. So, apprenticeships in those days were the key training mechanism.
So you had the apprenticeship, and that lasted how long?
4 years.
4 years. And what happens at the end of the apprenticeship?
Well, then you have to go and find a job, right? And a few people stayed on at Harwell, but there wasn't a lot of opportunity for routine work at Harwell. But I knew I wouldn't be staying there anyway, and I looked around and I applied to a few companies, and digital was one of them. And after I'd been for the interview, I remember it was John Crouch who interviewed me, and Peter Jones, and they their interviewing technique was different from most people's interviewing technique. They didn't sit in the table and ask, lots of questions. They put a circuit diagram in front of me and asked me to explain how it works. So I did, and they said, "Right, thank you," and asked me to step outside. And 5 minutes later, they said, offered me the job.
And did you saw the job? Was it advertised in a newspaper? Where did you see the job?
It was I think it was advertised in the Reading Chronicle, if my memory serves me right. I'm not 100% sure about that.
And what was the position, the job you were looking
It
at?
just said module repair technician, because that's what the job was.
And what's a module for people who don't know?
Well, in those days, modules were a little board called a flip chip, and there were no integrated circuits in those days. They just had discrete components, transistors, and inside the computers, there were literally hundreds of these boards, right? And that each would have a function. And they weren't very reliable, to be honest. And when you've got so many of these boards, just having connections was a problem. Anyway, the module repair technician was the person who was going to fix these. All the engineers in the field did was unplug a module and plug a new one in. Okay, they didn't have the expertise to actually fix the module, so that was my job. And the other guy who was with me, he used to fix the memories, and in those days they were magnetic memories where there was a round core and it had 3 wires through it, and it was a one if the two met, or it was a 0. And so he had to rethread these cores, and he'd to take hours just rethreading one memory. It was a whole difference, and it was only like 1K of memory.
And what was your role? How complicated or involved was your job as a module repairman?
Module repair, a whole stack of modules would come in, hundreds of them, and I would test them, and I would repair to component level. When I fixed it and tested it, then it would be back to the stock for field engineers to use.
So this is very much not like computers as we know them today, is it?
Not at all.
Very much a physical, mechanical way of repairing and working computers.
Yeah, I mean, this is before the integrated circuits. It's before everything was done down to the very last component. So resistors, capacitors, things that people don't really understand today.
We're using solder nines to repair these things?
Oh yes, absolutely. Yeah. So, these days, replacing a chip on a board is done by machine. In those days they didn't exist.
So did you, you said you applied, you did, DEC was you did a whole series of applications. Who else did you apply to? And I suppose, did you have much knowledge of DEC at this time? Were you aware of who they were?
I was aware who they were. I wasn't aware of their products. I knew they were, they weren't a computer company at that stage, because I don't know if you realise it, but PDP stands for Program Data Processor. And the word computer really didn't come into meaning until some years later. It was a programmed data processor. That's what it was. And it was only subsequent did the word computer start getting used to say that that's what that was. So what I knew of digital was it was a small company. I knew it was American, and I was interested in that because I wanted to go to America. And so that, to be honest, was one of the other reasons why I was focused on that company. Whilst when I joined, I didn't know a lot about their products. Probably within 6 months, I knew quite a lot about their products.
So the idea of working for an American company and possibly to travel was in your kind of mind at this point?
Oh yes. Well, I wanted to travel, but actually working for an American company, because at that time, if you worked for an American company, there was huge amount of opportunity. Working for someone like the GPO, there was not.
And what year did you join?
It was late 1970, so from 71 onwards, really.
So DEC was still quite small at this point.
It was. I joined in Arkwright Road, where they had two buildings. The building I was in was mostly computer special systems, and we had a little office for three of us. Over the road was logistics and Max van Dera, who would fix the teletypes, and upstairs would be Jeff Shingles, managing director at that time, and a bit of admin. And most of the people actually were in CSS. We only had one telephone line, and at 2 o'clock every day, the tannoy would go off and say, Maynard call for whoever it was, and they would have to go and use the phone because we only had one line at that time.
What would Maynard be? Maynard is the head office in the United
Yeah.
States. What was it? One call, a regular call every day from Maynard?
Every day at 2 o'clock.
What were they calling about every day at 2 o'clock?
Well, at that time, you couldn't just lift the phone and call. It just couldn't do it. So they had this daily call, which would go round to each person in the office who needed to speak to whoever they needed to speak to in the US. And so they'd use the tannoy in the office to indicate who's the next on the phone.
So one call, and would lots of people join that call, or is it one person?
No, it's one person at a time, right? So John Saunders was in charge of CSS at that time. He would speak to his counterpart in the US, and they'd talk about whatever they want. Then it would go to one of the technical guys to speak to who he wants, right? And that's how it would be every day.
How long would the calls last? Was it?
I don't really know, to be honest, but I would say about an hour.
So one call a day with Maynard
Yeah,
about technical issues and business stuff like that.
yeah. Because Maynard at that time was just the mill in Maynard. I don't know if you're aware of the mill there. It's an amazing building. It was then anyway. But the counterparts, yeah, I mean, communication was more difficult in those days.
So what was Arkwright Road like? You described the functions. It was a series of buildings, I think, wasn't
It's two
it?
buildings.
And what were they? Were they old, new? Were they kind of built for purposely?
No, they weren't
refurbished,
new.
or
They
what were
weren't new. I don't know how old they were, but the Arkwright Road is not a long road. It's a cul-de-sac, in fact. And we were about in the middle of the road. So we were one side of the road, and Jeff Shingles in the other building is the other side of the road. So he could look out of his window, and he did, and watch people arrive. So I would say over the road, there was probably, well, in logistics, there was three people. There was Frank Rowe and Liz Crichton. Well, there's a couple. They got married. She worked for him. They got married. And we had Max van Dera, who fixed the teletypes. We had upstairs a few admin people. Brenda Sara, as she was the secretary. So I would say there was probably 12 or 14 people over the road. And over the other side where I was in CSS, I would say there was probably, I don't know, 20, 25. I'm not really sure.
What was the work CSS did?
Well, the problem is that Digital had in the early days, of course, they've built a computer, but it's only usable if you can interface it with something, okay? It wasn't like today where you could run a program and do complicated mathematic things. I mean, first and foremost, to load a program, you were inputting it on punched paper tape. So that was the first thing. So what computer systems would do is they would build interfaces for customers for a particular requirement. Okay, and there was all sorts of interfaces they built, and different computers would have a different method of interfacing. Right. The most simplest thing is like your teletype, for example, that has to be interfaced to the computer. and there were commands to do it. That was built in, right? But if you wanted to interface to another device that existed but couldn't be connected, then they would build that interface, and that would have its own set of commands. These days we talk about firmware and everything doing all this. Well, this was the actual hardware executing instructions. You know, when you started the computer, for example, on a PDP-8, you'd have to put the RIM loader in, and you'd have to load it in on switches, and it's about 10 instructions to allow you to read in the binary loader, which then can read in your program. So, you know, computer special systems, without them, it was difficult for the sales force to sell the computer.
And this is an important part of DEC's work, it's customization, wasn't it?
That's right. I mean, more important than most people realise, to be honest. I think, and it wasn't just late, at that time, it was mostly hardware, but after a few years, it was software was a big part of it. But very few people realised that DEC wrote huge amounts of software.
And where was the software being written? Was there software being written in Arkwright Road? Because Arkwright Road seems to have evolved over the years, hasn't it?
Yeah, it evolved over the years. I don't think software was ever written in Arkwright Road. It certainly started off being written in the States, and in years later, it was written in, some of it was written in Reading, but it wasn't really until quite a bit later on when that happened.
So what's it like? What's the atmosphere like in CSS and Arkwright Road? And obviously you're quite young. How old are you at this point?
I'm 73 now.
No, at that point in.
Oh, that point, I joined digital when I guess I was 20 or 21.
And what's the workforce like there? Is it kind of male, young? Was it kind of very busy? What kind of describe the kind of working environment?
Oh, everyone was. I mean, you were hard pushed to find too many people over 30. That was for sure, which was great. I had a great sports and social club, and yeah, I mean, it was good. I think I don't know how old Jeff Shingles was at that time, but he was probably one of the oldest. Yeah, I mean, but mostly everyone was young. I mean, DEC was a very young orientated company anyway, and it carried on being for years on.
And I spoke with other people who worked at CS at this era, and it was kind of described as more kind of garage than laboratory. I mean, was that kind of a sense that you kind of got there? Things being kind of made, soldered together down there, or was it more kind of white room environment? How did it contrast?
No, it wasn't a white room environment. I'll tell you, absolutely not. It was very much a garage environment. No, I meant it was the early days of in there, and they put together what they needed to put together to allow the salesman to make sales.
And it's interesting that, I mean, this is also an era before common standards and interfaces existed. So they were custom. A lot of this work, the interface, the computers couldn't talk to other systems without this work that was going on here.
That's right. We didn't. There were no standards as such, because everything in, you know, everything from the computer itself onwards was proprietary to digital, and it wouldn't matter if it wasn't, because there was no one else.
So how are you feeling of yourself at this point? You've kind of landed in this American company in quite an exciting young environment, workplace. How are you kind of reflecting on things?
I'm buzzing on it. I'm loving it. And what happened to me next was the PDP-8E had been released, and CSS got their first PDP-8E. Now these had much more complicated boards, and they were the first ones I think they're pretty much the first ones that had a few integrated circuits on it, basic TTL logic. And I ended up being the only person fixing the PDP-8E modules. And these were bigger modules. They were sort of 12 inches square, and much more complicated as well. And so I'd be in my little room fixing the module, and then going out and borrowing CSS's PDP-8E to test it, because it was only one. And DEC in the UK sold hundreds and thousands of PDP-8Es. So it became more complicated, and the US decided they were going to build a form of automated testing of these modules because of the complexity. We had one of these machines, but it wasn't very successful, to be honest. we still had to get back to the original way of fixing them.
So you're at CSS, and what's life like? What's Reading like at this point as well? Describe it, because we've seen, well, we're here in Reading today, and we see it as it is. What was same then, or is it kind of a different atmosphere? Buildings different then?
Well, a lot of it was different. The trolley bus station was there, where the Oracle is now, and it was a much smaller place, to be honest. I, I can't remember when Fountain House was built, but the big change came when they built the Butts Centre, which is now called Broad Street Mall, with Fountain House above it. I think that's when the start of real change happened in Reading. But prior to that, Reading was really still a small place. I mean, I could drive all around Reading very quickly, and I did, because after I got promoted from modular repair and I went into field service, and I was going from office to office looking after machines in the various offices. So I would spend time in virtually every office DEC had over the next few years.
So how many offices did you visit? Did they have in the town, or how many did you visit?
At one point, they had the top 4 floors of Fountain House, Portman Road, which was Central and Southwest Field Service. They had King's Road, which was Northern European support and others, and admin. They still had Arkwright Road. They had a training centre, which was at Heckfield. What else did they have? Oh, golly gosh. It's hard to think of all these, but and of course they had all their regional offices in other towns. I'm sure there's more, but I can't think what they are.
Were DEC people hardly visible in the town, or did they kind of blend in? Could you see, armoured DEC people washing through Reading at this point, or was their profile noticeable in town?
Only if they were wearing their DEC badge. I've still got my original DEC badge. Okay. I wouldn't say so, no. I mean, Reading at that time had a lot of young people in it anyway. So I'm not sure walking the streets, unless you knew the person, I'm not sure you could say that must be a DEC person,
Were they kind of fairly smartly dressed, suits, or what was the attire?
Well, it was mixture. I mean, in CSS, it was very relaxed, to be honest.
What would you be wearing in CSS then?
Well, for me, I would. What was I? Well, I would probably be wearing the sort of thing I'm wearing now, to be honest. But all the salespeople and the field offices, it was suit and tie would be the norm. I mean, even when in modular repair, I would have had a tie, even in modular repair.
And were their favourite pubs? What were the DEC pubs?
Oh, the famous Black Boy pub was where we had the Wednesday evening social meeting. That was one of their. There was one just up the road from King's Road. I can't remember, Eaton Arms, no, something like that, which I don't think it's there anymore. But after work in the pub was very popular, no matter what DEC office you were in, I can tell you. We kept the pubs going, no question about it.
Where was the Black Boy? Is that around here?
The Black Boy is, let me think, it's not in the town centre. It's, oh God, I can't. Yeah, out on the road, Shimfield Road somewhere. I think it's still there, actually. But I think they've changed the name.
So that's out there. And was it customary to just head there after work, lunchtimes as well, or?
Lunchtime sometimes, particularly if you were in a DEC, you've gone to a DEC office outside Reading and you'd had a meeting, you might have lunch in the pub. But it was mostly after work.
Did all the offices have their own pubs as well, or units being DEC have like their own sort of preferred pubs, or did everyone just go to the same pub?
I think there was a set of pubs, usually nearest the office in question, to be honest. I can't, when I was at Fountain House, I can't remember what it was there, but Fountain House was the place which brought a lot of people together. Northern European support was in Fountain House on the 7th floor for a period, and modular repair was on the 7th floor for a period as well. And actually, on the 9th floor was software engineering. They had a whole floor just for software engineering.
What's Fountain House like inside? It sounds like it must have got quite busy, and I imagine it's not a building that's built for this kind of stuff, is it?
It's not, and you knew about the fire we had there.
Tell me about that.
Oh yeah, well there was a fire, and not that long after we moved in, and so up in the lift shafts are the pipes for the fire brigade to connect their hoses to put out the fire. So the water was turned on when this fire occurred, and unfortunately the builders had failed to put the caps on all the way up, so the water poured all into the lift shafts and they couldn't use it for putting the fire out. But it completely destroyed 2 of the floors of the building, and yeah, that caused a bit of a problem.
And everyone's had to go to evacuate, I'd imagine, at that point and get out somehow.
Yeah. I mean, DEC had a few fires. There was one in Basingstoke which completely destroyed the entire building. The Crescent, it was called, and it was up the road from the Basingstoke Support Centre, and it started in the roof, and within 15 minutes the whole building was on fire.
That's insane. Tell me about, so you've got Fountain House. Is it an old building inside, or is it?
Oh no, this was a brand new building. The whole, it was built on top of the Butt Centre.
Yeah.
Right, and it was 10 floors.
When was it built? What year, roughly?
Well, I guess they probably started building in the, my guess is, the late 70s or early 80s. I'm not absolutely sure, to be frank.
Mm-hmm. So a reasonably modern building.
Oh yeah,
oh
yeah, and it's still there. But yeah, it was, to be honest, it probably wasn't the ideal building for our business, but we were there, and it was probably fine for software engineering, to be honest, because they could the way they were laid out. But for modular repair and that, we did it, but it cost the company a lot of money to put all the extra power and everything in.
So that's Fountain House. What was I suppose, the working environment like? Obviously, it's a lot of people, a lot of young people.
Yeah.
I'd imagine there's a lot of money flowing around, a lot of salaries, aren't there? What's the kind of atmosphere like? The day-to-day workplace like? Is it a young place to work, an enjoyable place to work, or is it kind of tense, hard working? Describe what the workplace.
Well, digital generally was work hard, play hard. I mean, all the time I was there, you know, I wouldn't say there was any real time when I wasn't enjoying working for DEC. It was, frankly, great. I did work very long hours, and I do mean seriously long hours, and so did everyone else. But, you know, if something had to be done, it was done. You know, there was none of this, oh, well, I've got to go home and, you know, feed the cat or something. You know, it got done. And I remember one distinct situation, the day before my birthday, at 11 o'clock at night, I get a call and I say, they've got real problems at Bangor University. Can you go now? And so I had to, my wife beside herself, because she'd organised something for my birthday. And so I drove the 5 hours up the A5 to Bangor University, got there at 4 in the morning, and sent the guys off to have some breakfast while I have a look at this. By about 7, I got it fixed. They came back and I said, well, I've got to go. And then drove all the way back again. And yeah, my wife never forgave me for that.
What was the workplace like? Was it a fun sort of place where a lot of relationships were formed, a lot of bonds were formed at this point?
Yeah. I mean, there were a lot of good relationships, and everyone went out of their way to help everyone else. I mean, okay, I was still young then, so I probably didn't identify politics going on, but I didn't really see much in the way of politics in those early days. everyone helped everyone. If you asked someone, could you help me with this, the answer would always be yes. You know, it was just a can-do attitude is what I can best describe it as.
You spoke earlier also about how a lot of relationships were formed, a lot of people married. Tell me a little bit about that, just the kind of stuff we were talking about earlier.
Well, I mean, the social club really was the catalyst for this, because if you were either meeting up at the pub or you were going to some social event, and the big social event of the year was the Christmas party, which was nicknamed the Grope, because that's I won't go into details because that's how it ended up. But you know, let me put it this way: everyone really enjoyed themselves, and even, you know, even if they knew they had to get up early in the next morning, they would enjoy themselves late into the night. You know.
It was a social club. It was it happened everywhere. It was like an organisation. It would throw events and
Yeah,
things like that.
yeah.
You were describing how you encountered your wife. You married a fellow DEC employee, and it wasn't just limited to department to department relationships, was it? If you could tell us a little bit how that.
Well, yeah, my own wife, she worked in field service, but a totally different part of field service. She worked in the central control desk, which was a 24-hour desk, which both customers and engineers could call at any time for whatever reason. And if I was on site, for example, and I needed a part, that's where I'd call, and I'd often speak to my wife. But, well, she wasn't my wife then, but I would speak to her. And then subsequently, of course, one of the other women in the central control desk suggested that I meet up with her at a social event, and that's kind of how it started. I mean, it was quite common, to be frank with you.
And you got to know each other through that, and you got married ultimately.
Yeah, we got married in '81, and so we're still married, you'll be pleased to know.
Sorry, your wife's name is
Jean.
June. And it's always when you meet someone on the phone, it's slightly different. You talk on the phone, different to meeting face to face. Was it somebody you expected? Was it a pleasant surprise?
Oh, I mean, yeah, she got my attention, that's for sure. Yeah, she was quite shy, but that changed in time. But yeah, I mean, it blossomed. I suppose we carried on going out for, I guess, a couple of years, and then I said, well, I suppose we better get married. That's what. So that was it. So I guess I probably got to know her in, well, '79. Well, in fact, it must have been late '79 because she didn't join digital until '79.
And would it be DEC marriages were kind of a sort of a common?
Very common, very common. And I talked about the logistics in Arkwright Road. At that time, the manager was Frank Rowe. His administrator was Liz Crichton, and they got married, and then they moved to the US at a house in New Hampshire. I visited them, and that was a classic example of marriages within the company. It happened a lot, to be honest, and it wasn't until probably after the '80s when it wasn't so much. But in those, it was such a knit community up until the late '80s that's why it was so common.
What do you think contributed to this? You describe it as a knit community, and we've heard in the past this description of the DEC way and doing the right thing. And you've described also a thing there earlier about you drove up to Bangor for the customer. That could be there was a great sense of customer service. Were you ever aware of this concept called the DEC way, and what did it kind of mean to you, if anything?
I mean, one of the training things was very much service excellence. I mean, through the '70s and '80s, it was focused all the time on service excellence. And in the '70s in particular, late '70s, there was a big push in America, service is the number one. And in fact, I got an award for services. I have this plaque on my wall at home, service excellence. And each year, subsequently, field service would have an award for people who'd given good service. And that was a big push, and customer satisfaction was number one. And that's where the first time I learnt the best definition of customer satisfaction. And the definition is meeting or exceeding the customer's expectation, but correctly setting it in the first place.
Was there any tension between do the right thing for the deck or do the right thing for the customer? Was there ever any trade-offs had to be made, or was it ever like irreconcilable?
No, it's always do the right thing for the customer. Absolutely. I remember I was in where was I? No, I was in Kuwait to fix an 1170 which had given lots of problems, and the black backplane had a problem. This was very expensive, and one would have to be made in the US and shipped over. So I was not keen on telling everybody that this is going to have to be replaced. This was megabucks. Anyway, I carefully said to the customer, well, in fact, the customer said to me, what do you think we should be done about this? And I said to him, if I'm honest, we should replace it. Well, we better replace it, he said. And I called up and I said, well, we're going to get a new one. There was near shock horror about it because in those days that was a significant amount of money. And I said, well, here's the situation. We got 1170. He's just about to buy two more. I think we have to replace it. And my immediate manager said, oh, we can't do that. So he went to his boss and he says, absolutely, get it done. You know. And that's kind of what I was expecting, even though I was tentative about raising the subject almost. But because I knew the implication of what I was saying to them. But the company definitely focused on the customer, really focused, as opposed to just saying it.
Why was that, do you think?
That was right from the top. That was Ken Olsen. You know, I mean, Ken was very focused on this. And I remember when I first went to Maynard, I said, I want to see Ken Olsen's office. So two of us went up to his office and spoke to his secretary. Said, can we have a look at his office? He wasn't there. Oh, yeah. And so he's got all these plaques on the wall around in the office, and nearly all of them were focused on customer satisfaction. You know, he was very focused on that. So that trickled down from the very top.
And did the deck way influence any other kind of character, like around the workplace? We hear a lot about personal advancement and courses. The staff were kind of, there was also a paternalistic relationship with staff, almost it seemed like encouraged to move on, be promoted.
Oh, absolutely. Well, we had what was called JP&Rs, job plan and reviews. And if a manager hadn't done this every 6 months, right, he was in trouble, you know. And basically, as part of the plan, it's, well, what training courses are you going on? I have never been on so many training courses as when I was at DEC. I could have brought along the certificates, right? I've got that many certificates on products I've been trained on. And DEC was very focused on training, not just technical, but non-technical. When I was a consultant engineer, one thing that happened every winter is we took over Port Marion in North Wales, the whole village, for support training 1 week in 3. And I'd spend a week up there and we would provide training, non-technical training. It wasn't technical, it was how to handle the customer, how to provide good service to the customer, not just fix his machine. And in fact, one of those articles in there of the Sports Centre is on that. John Allen and myself, we ran it, and we did that for a long time.
This is important because engineers typically are not typically customer facing, and also they're actually quite pleased not to be customer facing, aren't they?
This was different. I mean, this was training to make sure when they're in front of the customer, they're doing the right thing. That was the whole thing behind it. It was called Support Fundamentals. And we provided no technical training during this week course. We provided role plays. We would have a lot of role plays and that sort of thing of customer and you, how you handle this situation. You're in a difficult situation. What you going to do in this situation? So that was what support fundamentals was all about, and it was all about making sure the customer was satisfied, even in those very difficult situations.
And what was the reception to this from the engineers? Were they willing? They were reluctant, shy to do this kind of thing?
Well, some maybe yes, but every engineer had to go on the course. It was mandatory. So each course would typically have 30 or so people on it, and we would do it 1 week in 3 in the winter months when Port Marion was closed to the public.
And so so DEC is making a conscious effort to advance people, to refine them, and also to advance their careers as well. So let's get back to talk about you just a little bit here. So you were in field services, but you got your trip to the United States, didn't you, to Maynard? When did that happen?
Well, my first trip I think was around 74, and when then I spent more than 6 months in Marlborough. Marlborough is where the LCG group were, large computer group, which is where the KA10, KI10 and KL10 are based.
And what are they?
So, sorry?
And what were they?
These were mainframe computers, 36-bit. The KL10 was DEC's most powerful computer built at that time. And by today's standards, it's not. To give you an idea, the power supply for this was 900 amps, more than a whole street of houses would use today. It was big, complicated, and I spent 6 months over there during the development of the product. So the DEC System 10 and the DEC System 20 use the same basic processor.
Were you involved in the development, or why was it important for you to be there during the development of the product?
There was, just to be clear, there was a very great focus on maintainability engineering. And in fact, in the US, there was a whole department of about 50 people just on maintainability engineering. So as the design of the product was being put together, and I was assigned to the maintainability engineering group, and as it's being put together, we have to determine whether that's maintainable in the field and that sort of thing. So you've got the guys actually designing the circuit diagram that's going to make it work, and there's us making sure that when they put it together, it can actually be maintained. And in the case of the KL10, the biggest problem was the power supply. It was huge. I mean, the power supply would take up half this room. You know, it was a different ballpark.
Who would have used the KL10? What kind of customers would have gone for this?
Universities and research establishments. In the UK, York University had the very first one. Bangor had one. Dundee University had one. Cancer Research had, no, they had a DEC System 20. But those three were the first 3 KL10s in the UK, and they were expensive.
And how are these different to the MIDI computers, which DEC had made its name in? Are they substantially bigger, larger? It's back to the mainframe, to more IBM style?
Yeah, I mean, basically, a KL10 would be against a large IBM 360 mainframe. In fact, more powerful than it, in fact. And they cost a lot of money. And in fact, I don't know how they did it, but they even allowed 4 KI-10s to be sold to Russia because I installed them. And because it was the Soviet Union then, it was a whole different ballpark in those days.
Let's come on to that in a sec. So you're in the States, and so you're in Marlborough. And how many trips did you get to the States as working for DEC? 1, 2, and what's it like at this time in the States?
No, I was. I meant that there came a point where I was regular on flights TWA to Boston. You know, Trans World Airlines doesn't exist anymore. But no, I was a gold card holder on Trans World Airlines, so. I usually got upgraded, even in those days.
You've come a long way. The kid who wanted to get the trip out to the States has finally got his way, hasn't he? How are you feeling? Feeling pretty good about that?
Oh yeah, I was pretty good about. I was very happy about that. Yeah, And my wife wasn't so happy because in those days we didn't have mobile phones, so I had to use my AT&T credit card from the when possible to phone her to chat and tell her when I'm back. But they were good trips, great trips, in fact, to be honest.
What was the States like? I mean, still there's so much. The United States and UK are so similar, aren't they? In many ways, it must have felt like a different world at that point.
Well, in the Boston area, Boston's very European, to be honest, even today. That wasn't so bad. I loved going out there, to be honest. And when I was out there in Marlborough for 6 months, I hired a Ford Pinto car from $1 a day rent-a-car, and I mean, and I do mean $1 a day rent-a-car. It wasn't a great car, but it was cheap, and I went all around the place. I went down to Philadelphia to see where at the weekends and things like that.
And did you ever get a chance to fly on the famous DEC helicopter fleet?
Oh yes, I did that a couple of times.
Describe that. What was that?
Yeah, well, they had the helicopter went from Parker Street in Maynard, which is another building, about a mile from the mill, and it can only take 2 passengers. It wasn't a big helicopter, and we would fly over Boston, and we'd land at Logan Airport, and he'd have to come in as though he was a plane along the runway about a few feet above the ground, and then turn off on the taxiway. That was very good, because in those days they've dug the road underground now in Boston, but before that the expressway was on metal stilts, and you were sitting in traffic jams for ages. So it was a good way to get to the airport, I tell you.
So it's cheaper to fly. It was faster to go by helicopter than it was to get a car.
Oh, without question. And what's more, it was cheaper because DEC owned the helicopter.
And it was the largest private helicopter fleet, I think, in existence at the time.
I don't know if that's the case, but they certainly had quite a few of them.
And you couldn't reserve a place, could you? There was no sense of hierarchy on that.
There was no sense of hierarchy. You just phoned up and said, "Is there room for me on the next flight?" And if the answer was yes, you're on the flight. And it didn't matter what. I mean, that's another thing in DEC. Yes, you have managers who were responsible for their team and everything, but in every other respect, you were on a par with everybody. I could go up and I could talk to anyone, no matter how senior, and they would talk to me as though I'm just the co-worker that you work with every day. And that was a DEC way.
Why was that important?
Well, it meant that you literally can speak to anybody. You work for a lot of companies now, and people have never even spoken to, 2 tiers up from their manager, right? Because it was not the done thing, as it were. Well, that wasn't the case in DEC. You could talk to anybody on any subject.
So we came back to sort of your own career advancement. So you mentioned the trip to the States and the Soviet Union as well. You were involved in the Soviet deal as well. You became, I think it was, correct me on the job title, the first consulting sales engineer in Europe?
Consultant engineer, yeah.
What is that role?
I actually listed it in that piece of paper in there, if you want to look at it later. But basically, I ran a consultancy group.
And you were the first person in this role, weren't you?
Yeah, first person.
In UK. And what does the job
in Europe. And the job entailed everything from advising on new technology, advising people like John Barrett, because I remember John Barrett sending me an email saying, I've heard about mobile phones. How can we utilise those in our business to improve our business? And so that was one of my tasks immediately to go. And that was in before people actually had mobile phones. It was just being launched. Motorola had just shown it would work. And clearly we were a company that were trying to be at leading edge wherever possible. But it was those sort of things. Of course, when we did the London Marathon or the Reading Marathon, it fell to the consultancy group to organise that and things like that.
And what was so you're advising the business and customers as well?
Yeah.
What kind of things would you be say, how would you be engaged with customers?
Well, I'd be supporting customers more than anything, or supporting engineers in the field that have a problem, or and the team would. Um, there was a lot of environmental situations that were where there wasn't expertise in the field. One of the guys in my team, Paul Holder, was an expert on everything to do with air conditioning, because in those days we pumped out huge amounts of heat, and without air conditioning, that was it. It wouldn't work. So air conditioning and just prepping rooms ready for installation was very important. And so we would consult with the customer on what needed to be in, because the customer would have to arrange for this. It's his rooms, and how we would transport things and that sort of thing. So it was very much a consulting situation on a broad range of things, not just the physical digital equipment.
And so the career is moving along, and do you have this sense of the kind of this DEC culture of you being, I suppose, pushed by your managers? We have this sense of people were promoted if you weren't moving every 3 years. It's like you weren't doing your job, or the managers weren't doing their job in advancing your career. Will you sense this concept as being pushed along into new opportunities?
Not so much pushed along, but given opportunities. The manager would often say, would you like to do this, and would you like to do that? And if it was to go on a training course, I would nearly always say yes. And would you go? I remember my very first trip abroad for DEC was actually into Gothenburg in Sweden, the Volvo car company, and they'd had a flood, so a whole load of us had to go, and that was my first in there. And my manager just said to me, would you be interested in going? Oh yeah, absolutely. So I think it wasn't so much pushing as giving opportunity.
And did you sense how much freedom were you given within a role, or were you kind of like given a script, like you're going to do things this way?
No, you were given a lot of freedom. I meant you knew where the limitations are, but I would say you were given considerable freedom than most people are today. You could make decisions without referring back to your manager within guidelines.
So there's very much a high trust relationship, also a high responsible relationship.
Absolutely. Because, in fact, the company really wanted you to make decisions. They didn't want everything having to go up the chain to make what could have been just your decision. I'll give you an example. We had a plant in Galway. It had a KL10, and one weekend we were assigned to having to move this machine, which is and we had to have it all up and running, close it down Friday night, up and running by Monday morning. So it was going to take about 6 of us to do this. At the time, the rule was no more than 2 employees on the same plane. Okay? So we were all booked on various flights through on Friday that got us to Dublin. Okay? And then we'd all meet up and head off. However, there was fog. Okay? And I arrived at 6:30 in the evening on Friday evening, only to find none of them have gone because of fog. But in those days, they had the shuttles that went to Belfast, Edinburgh and Glasgow and that. And I said, okay, just this once, all get on the Belfast shuttle. And because I was flying, I had one of these special credit cards, because in those days it was all paper tickets. So I could get everybody on the Belfast shuttle, and off we went. Now, technically speaking, I should have got authority for doing that, but I didn't. But no one was going to question it, I knew, because it was so important that this got done. However, so we got to Belfast, we hired an Avis car, drove down to Dublin, and just outside Dublin at 11 o'clock at night, the car conked out, flat battery. We would buy a fish and chip shop. We'd stop to get some fish and chips. And this Irishman comes along and says, you've got a flat battery. Yeah, that's right. Just a moment. So he goes round and comes back with a battery and jumper leads. So he puts it on and we get the car started and thank him and off we go. I said, well, thanks very much. Unfortunately, we didn't get so far. We got to the middle, about halfway to Galway, and the car conked out again. So we ended up, we went over to a pub which was still open at 2 a.m, used the phone, called Seamus back in Dublin. Seamus, can you come and pick us all up? Which he did. And we picked up the next morning, I had to pick up another hire car. But I mean, it's things like that which DEC was good at. People would do what was needed to solve the problem.
And what is the, obviously DEC here in Reading has kind of evolved. It's moved into DEC Park by this point, hasn't it? All the offices are suddenly be consolidated. Describe DEC Park, and does that atmosphere transfer or kind of become magnified in any way at DEC Park?
Well, DEC Park was, from my point of view, good and bad. It was good that it brought lots of people together, but an embarrassment for me, because by the time DEC Park was in place, the UK had about 10,000 employees. Okay, so I'd walk down DEC Park, and lots of people would say, "Good morning, Keith. Good morning, Keith," and I had no idea who they were, you know. But they knew who I was because they've seen my picture and everything, and that's when, to a certain degree, that became not so good because it had become so large. We were still in the mode of doing the right thing and everything, but there's huge numbers of people that I didn't know. I mean, and nor did other people. They knew people in their locality.
So it's becoming a little more impersonal.
Yeah. It wasn't intentional. It was just the volume of people.
And do you notice DEC changing? Obviously, that's an important change. Do you notice any other changes starting to creep in here?
Well, from a technical point of view, DEC was sort of losing its way. There was considerable focus on VAX VMS, which is understandable, you know, and the development of the chips that went into the VAX, you know, it was a lot of development and very good. But I could certainly see what was happening in the computer world beyond DEC. And one of the things that was happening was more and more people were moving to Unix. And DEC wasn't even talking about it. And I was getting concerned about this. DEC did eventually bring out its version of Unix called Ultrix. Wasn't that successful? Well, I don't think it was. But it was probably a little bit too late.
So the technology, it's starting to lose its way a little bit on the technology focus.
Yeah. I think what had happened is in the early days, it was leading edge. And that was really the team under Ken Olsen really focused on that. I think as things moved along and we became much more a business company as opposed to a technical company, I think that's when it started. The focus was definitely sell more VAXes, you know. So it was, I think that was where it was good we sell more VAXes, but of course it's the technical, if you're at the leading edge of technology, then that's when the customers want that. And I think that's when things started to go astray, shall we say.
So you're at DEC Park, things are starting to change, and you're meeting lots of people, obviously, and you've become we saw your picture in the magazine. Was it Digitales?
Yeah.
So people can see you from that. It's interesting people are coming up to you and saying hello to you on that basis.
Well, they just pass when we're walking down the corridor of DEC Park. I mean, I don't think they're actually coming up to me so much, but you know, people recognise you, and I recognise some of them, but I probably can't put names to them.
And what generally is, how would you describe DEC Park? I mean, what's the inside like?
Oh, the environment was actually good. It was all open space. I mean, there were some offices, but basically it was all open space. So just desks everywhere, everyone had their own desk, and that was good. And at that time, it had a bank in Deck Park. It had a travel agent, and it had a good canteen and that sort of thing. So the service, everything was there, and that was all good, to be honest.
Did you see the senior staff mingling with people?
Oh yeah, I mean, oh yeah, that didn't really change. I mean, basically, you could speak to senior staff, no problems. Yeah,
What was the food like in the canteen?
can't really remember, to be honest.
I've heard talk of the sausage sandwiches.
Well, I'm sure they were good. Yeah, I did like sausage sandwiches, but no, I can't really. It was, yeah, I think the canteen was okay. I think when I was in the support centre in Basingstoke, the canteen was good there. I remember that. Yeah.
Did you ever use the bank or any of those shops internally?
Well, I'll tell you what I did use. We were in what was the building that was called V7, which I haven't talked about up to now. And V7 was Huntley and Palmer's building, okay? And we could go to the Huntley Palmer's shop and get biscuits at, very cheap. So I used to go there quite often.
What was V7? What were you doing in V7?
Well, for a period of time, logistics and support was in V7. All of support was in V7. I'm not sure how long we were there, a couple of years. It was a gross building, really. I mean, it wasn't that suitable. And it was a quite dirty place, to be honest. It was an old factory, really. But DEC needed space, and DEC was taking up whatever space it could get in Reading, whenever there was an opportunity, and this was just one of them. I didn't mention it earlier because I've forgotten V7, but I mean there were buildings that they would rent. They just needed space.
So it's becoming difficult for DEC in terms of just finding spaces around Reading.
Absolutely, and that was really what caused them to build Deck Park in the first place, because they knew we were expanding at a great rate, and there was limited number of buildings that they could take space that was suitable.
What was it like? I mean, the housing situation around here, trying to find somewhere to live, they must have had pressure from that as well.
A lot of people came from outside of Reading, to be honest, and yeah, people did live in Reading. A lot of people north Caversham and Emma Green and all that sort of area, they lived up there. But like I myself, at that time I was living in, where was I living? I was living in Cheveley, and I was commuting in. I mean, but in those days it wasn't a problem commuting in. I could make it into Reading in half an hour into the office without too much trouble. I wouldn't do that today.
It was driving, yeah.
Yeah. I have my Mark 1 Ford Cortina, white.
What happened? So you left DEC in 1987, I think, didn't you?
Yeah.
What was the circumstances? Why did you just say, great, you're having a great time at DEC, but suddenly you get a job somewhere else? What happened there?
Well, it was going back to when I was talking about losing its way. Technically, I was concerned. There were several things happening in the company that gave concern, but the biggest one is that from a technical point of view, we probably aren't leading edge anymore. We seem to have abandoned some of our core principles, added to the fact that a previous colleague of mine who was in support was now in the US and working for this small supercomputer company called Alliant Computer Systems in Littleton, Mass. And he contacted me and wanted to, and I went over there, met with the president and the other directors, and I thought this was the way forward. And they in fact built one of the first computer that could do 1 million floating point instructions in 1 second, right? So it was leading. We're back into the leading edge stuff, which was in great demand. That's what people wanted. They wanted more powerful computers. And so it was a hard decision, to be honest. If my wife was here, she'll tell you how hard it was.
What made it a hard decision?
Because I was loyal to DEC. I was really loyal to DEC. And I was actually very loyal to DEC, to be honest. And I could see what was happening. And what I didn't want is to be in a company when things went bad. But on the other hand, I was still very loyal to them. And I to and froed the decision over numerous days. Initially, I told them I wasn't going to take the job initially, and then I reversed it. And as my wife will tell you, it was the best decision I made.
What made you so reluctant? Where did that loyalty come from? Was it just experience, or was it other factors?
Well, I guess there's a lot of factors, but one of them is, all the people I'm working with, they were similar to me in that respect, is they were committed to the company. They were very much committed to the company, and I was as well. And so that's what made it, all these people I know and trust, I was walking away from. And that was hard.
Do you think that's usual to find that in a workplace?
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah.
Because I can tell you, I've not worked for any company since which I could say the same for. I mean, in my experience generally is everyone wants to know you when you're in the company. As soon as you walk out, you never hear from them again.
But DEC is different. You're still in touch with people today.
Indeed.
How would you kind of describe the relationships? Is it kind of lifelong relationships?
Some, definitely. I mean, even people I went to college with, I'm no longer in contact with, but I am in contact with people at DEC. I mean, we got some friends in Florida who have worked in various other companies, and we're in contact. In fact, we just had an invite to go over, right? And got another one. Several people around America. My wife's flying out to New York in October to meet up with one of the other friends who's in northern New York State. And yeah, I mean, we actually have a lot of friends who I would say in the US, they're all digital people. But I can't name one that's not a digital person.
What did you take with you from, I suppose, digital to Alliant?
Alliant.
What was it they saw in you? Because I think you said like it was your experience at DEC that made them in a way want you, wasn't it?
Well, it wasn't my technical experience, actually. It was my ability to build a service organisation. What they wanted was a European service organisation. And we built that across about 8 countries. And I ended up being the director of European operations for the company. And so, and the managing director of the German company and the French company. So, that actually gave me a lot of senior management experience as well. So that worked for me as well.
So you had this. So you basically built the European operations with DEC. Cool.
Well, no, this was the new company.
Alliant, okay.
Yeah.
So So you also went on to become, I think it was director at Alcatel Paris. I think as a result of this as well, didn't you? And then you said operations director for Alcatel.
Yeah, I was responsible for in 61 countries for Alcatel in service. Global service is what I was hired into, and it was interesting the way I got the job. I didn't apply for the job. There was a guy called Bill Padfield who at Alliant was a sales manager, and he went off to work for CETA, which is the world's largest networking company that no one's ever heard of. And the Cisco and the president of Alcatel contacted the president of Cisco, because they were distributors, and said, do you know someone who can set up a service organisation? So he contacted Bill, and Bill left a voicemail for me and said, you ought to speak to this guy, Don Dunagay in Paris. So just before Christmas, I think it's about 23rd, I called, we had a chat. He says, you've got to come over. So I took a plane over there, we had a chat. He says, well, do you want to start on January the 2nd? So I did, as on a consultancy basis. But after 3 months, he says, you've got to become an employee. I can't have a consultant running the part of the company. So I became an employee. And that's how it happened.
So looking back, would you say how has DEC shaped you get to this position?
Oh, DEC did, absolutely. Because what DEC did is I had in-depth technical knowledge, but I'd actually grown into be able to manage things as well, not only manage customers, but manage in the service organisation. And then I grew out, and when I went to Alliant, then that just grew even more. So yeah, no, DEC was everything that allowed me to grow. There's no question about that.
Any kind of individuals you would look back on as having shaped you, put you in the right direction at the right sort of turn, or stewarded you in some way?
Well, I suppose one of them is a guy by the name of Graham Morland. He was in support, and he was very much helped me. There was no question. My boss at when I was in Central and Southwest Field Service, his name was Brian Lowe. I mean, he was always trying to. He wanted his team to be right at the pinnacle, so he would always be pushing forward to get you to do more things. So I guess that he as well. So there was various people, and pulling out individuals is actually quite a bit difficult, because everyone wanted to help everyone else in DEC, and that was one of the real benefits.
And obviously, DEC is no longer with us. What do you think its legacy is, either on you, and in the wider world? Does it leave a legacy or an impact?
Oh, it leaves a legacy for all the people who work there who are still alive. I mean, you've only got to see DECists. I mean, how many companies have 1,000 people who worked for a company that hasn't existed for whatever period it is, still going to a yearly AGM? I mean, how many companies does that happen? Well, I don't know any. And that is because of the type of people who were at DEC, you know. Their interviewing practices were very different from the average company, that's for sure. I mean, take my own son. If I was interviewing you and I just gave you a circuit diagram and tell me how it works, I mean, if you could do it, you got the job. If you can't, sorry, you're not the right person. I mean, I'm not saying that's exclusive, but you get my drift of what I'm talking about there. It was, what can you do? How well can you do it? How do you approach things? Are you easy to talk with? Because some people are difficult to talk to. And to be honest, some of the support fundamental training was all about that. I mean, how to interview people. There was some of that in it as well, because of course a lot of these people became managers. Nearly all managers in DEC were previously technical people.
Do you think, what was your thought when you saw the news DEC had been acquired? This was sometime after you left. What were your any kind of feelings?
Disappointment, to be honest, but not surprised. I meant, yeah, a big disappointment, particularly given the company that took them over first, because it was Compact that took them over first, and then HP took Compact over.
Why the disappointment?
Well, they were basically a low-end PC manufacturer, and DEC made and other PC-related products, of course they did, but they made a whole range going right up to the large computer group, which made it a very different company. So I wasn't sure how Compact was going to handle that. But no, disappointment is the answer to your question, but not surprise. And yeah, that was unfortunate, to be honest.
Does it have a technology legacy at all?
Well, I suppose it does, but I meant today. Well, I'll tell you what it does have, though. It has, which I, I think I provided you with one of the manuals, right, is when it came to project management and process management, a huge amount of work went into that, and got manual after manual on proper project management. My wife is still a member of the Project Management Institute, right, because she's a project manager. And what they did really well and train the people is project management, particularly in the software department. And I would say that is one of the big legacies for sure. I've still got the documentation, and training people on how to analyze things. Have you ever heard of Kettner-Traeger?
No.
Right, it was 40 years ago Kettner-Traeger was introduced, and it can be utilized, and we all went on the training course, and it can be utilized to find fault in anything, even if you don't know anything about the product. When you walk into the training room, on the wall is a complete diagram of a donut making machine. Okay, and the instructor, before we've even had the training on it, the instructor says, right, you can ask me any questions, but you've got to fix the problem. And the problem is, intermittently, it creates square donuts. Okay. You can ask me any question and I will give you a truthful answer, but I need you to find out what the cause of the problem is. So we all asked all these questions and no one found the answer. Okay. So then we had the course on what questions you should ask, what you should not. You know, what it is doing and what it's not doing. And, you know, it was very, I've still got the card of how to use Kettner-Traeger as the cheat sheet, as it were. And it meant that, and what we used to do in support fundamentals to train the guys is asking the right questions. You're a support person, but you can't possibly be trained on every product. However, you can ask questions of someone who's been on the training course, is trying to fix it, but hasn't fixed it. And asking the right questions. Well, did you test the 5 volts at the board, or did you only test it at the power supply? I only tested it at the power supply. Let's test it at the board. Do you know what I mean? And it was a very logical way of finding, and it wasn't just for technical things. It was in any application. And that was an important, and DEC brought this in. There's a complete manual on it. There's a cheat card. And Ken also brought this in. You know, he said, we ought to be doing this. And I've still got the card and I use the principles today.